In today's video, I'm going to teach you what you need to know about Leopard Gecko substrates. Now, let's start with putting you at ease about impaction. If you don't know about impaction, let me explain it. Impaction is essentially when a Leopard Gecko eats substrate and it blocks up their stomach, and then they can't naturally poop and pass it. You might ask, well, why is impaction not happening in the wild, but it is for some pet owners? And the answer to that question is bad husbandry. The number one thing that causes this is dehydration, or the gecko is sick and lacking nutrients. A normal, healthy, happy leopard gecko will eat pieces of substrate and bits of dirt as they eat, and then just poop it straight out like they would in the wild. Some info on the internet might say to never use substrate because they say it minimises risk. However, if a leopard gecko is sick enough to not even be able to pass some dirt, they are also sick enough to not be able to pass the bugs that they eat. So are they also not going to feed their gecko? I have always put geckos on substrate and I never have encountered impaction. Even when I worked in stores that had policies that I disagreed with and they made us use awful substrates like corn chip, even then it didn't happen. You can put leopard geckos on substrate right from hatching. In the wild, they're born crawling around in the dirt and sand. You don't need to worry about them being too young before you can give substrate, you can do it straight away. And often if you bought your leopard gecko from a store, it's much older than a hatchling anyway, so you're further along than that. Let's talk about how to make a cheap DIY mix for your substrate. You can do it cheaper by buying organic topsoil and then play sand. You can buy them from garden centres or places like hardware stores, or buy them online. We have a link down below. The way that topsoil is collected is they scrape a layer of topsoil off the top of the earth and then screen it the best they can and then bag it up, and away it goes for sale. Just sift through and have a look at your topsoil and make sure there isn't any sharp or dangerous objects in there, and then you're good to go. Now this is how to mix leopard gecko substrate. Mix both the soil and the sand into a container so you create a loamy dirt. And you can make different versions of this mix. It doesn't have to be exactly how I say it. You can add clay to add structure to your mix. You could use something like Zoom Ed's excavator clay and add that to a topsoil and play sand mix to add that clay-like structure. And depending how much of it you put in, it can help that topsoil and play sand mix hold some burrows. The next question is, how deep do you have your substrate? Whatever substrate mix that you use, it's important to give quite a decent level of depth. Make sure that it's several inches deep, so one, your leopard gecko can go digging in it, but also it's deep enough so that when the surface dries out, the layers beneath it maintain that moisture, and the deeper the substrate, the more moisture it can hold on to for longer. And then when your leopard gecko wants to dig down to a human microclimate and get down into those moisture pockets, it can. If you're using something like an under tank heater, that can actually warm it from beneath and dry out the substrate from beneath, and it actually destroys any chance, at least in that patch, of having a gradient from top to bottom of moisture. It does work much better if you have overhead heating. And please make sure that any heavy decorations are placed on the surface of the bottom of the tank, and then you put the substrate on top of that and around that, and not on top of substrate. That means if your leopard gecko digs around the bottom of a rock or something, it's not going to cause a cave in and crush itself. The other question is, how do we make sure that our substrate is clean? Well, the good thing about leopard geckos is they tend to poop in one area called a latrine, so cleaning up the substrate is relatively straightforward and easy. What you should do is take a big clump of soil around that feces and any soil that's touching the feces and throw that away. Now you don't need to do a full clean if the substrate isn't absolutely filthy. Often just cleaning and removing the poop and urotes is typically enough. The next question that I always get asked is, how do I do a bioactive substrate for my leopard gecko? Well, the whole purpose of a bioactive enclosure is there is insects in your enclosure that eat the feces and break that into smaller particulates, which then gets washed down into the soil, broken down by bacteria in that soil, and is made available for plants to take up into their roots, basically creating a cycle in your tank. Now the very same substrate mixes we've mentioned previously in this video with the topsoil and play sand work perfectly for bioactive. You can add springtails and isopods and the process will begin. Depending on how many you add initially depends how further along into the process you're going to get. The key way that this works is you have to have pockets of moisture in the soil for the springtails and isopods to escape down into, for them themselves to thrive. Some information on the internet also says that you must have a drainage layer. With dry species like this, I find it isn't really needed. Just don't overwater and flood your substrate, and then you won't need a drainage layer. Now, at the start of bioactivity, if you've only added a few springtails and isopods, I recommend still picking up that feces. However, once you get to the point that you find that the populations of springtails and isopods is growing and the feces actually disappears faster than you can clean it, you can just leave it. Now, if you want to make your substrate look like the substrate that leopard geckos are on in the wild, here's something for you. I'd recommend Jurassic bearded dragon substrate. Now, this is substrate taken straight out of Australia from the habitat of bearded dragons. Yes, Australia and not India and Pakistan where leopard geckos typically are found, but the consistency and look fits it perfectly. It has a clay-like consistency that really replicates that sandy, dusty, hard, craggy substrate from pictures of leopard geckos in the wild. And then once it's been baking under heat lamps, the surface of that substrate bakes to a hard crust whilst maintaining that moisture down below. Imagine that this fork is a leopard gecko digging into the substrate, making a burrow, and you can see how well it maintains its form. You can use this on its own, or you can incorporate it into one of your substrate mixes. This is going to make a leopard gecko tank look really realistic if that's what you're going for, and you can find that substrate link down below. I hope this helps you and answers your questions. I'll see you in the next video.